The Vexari War College stood as a testament to the military might of a species that had dominated their sector for millennia. Its grand amphitheater, with crystalline scales adorning the ceiling that refracted the light of twin suns, was designed to intimidate as much as to educate. Marble columns, each engraved with the battle tactics of legendary commanders, formed a circle around the central stage where generations of military minds had pontificated on the art of war. Holographic battle archives hovered at the edges of the room, ready to be summoned at a moment's notice to illustrate the glorious victories of Vexari history. Today, however, the amphitheater would host something unprecedented, a human. Commander Elena Cruz arrived early, standing at the edge of the stage as Vexari cadets and faculty filed in. Her plain, Navy uniform, adorned only with the silver pins of her rank and the small emblem of the United Earth Fleet, stood in stark contrast to the ornate battle armor and ceremonial weapons worn by the Vexari officers. She appeared almost diminutive among them, her 2 arms, 2 legs, and single pair of eyes, marking her as biologically simple compared to the multi-limbed, chitinous exoskeletons of her hosts. Yet there was something in her posture, a calm readiness that made several senior officers pause as they passed. Her eyes tracked movements with precision, and she seemed to be mentally cataloging every detail of the room. Not nervous, as the dean had expected, but observant, calculating. Dean Moral Vorun strode onto the stage, his 6 eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of mild agitation to those who knew Vexari biology. His ceremonial armor gleamed with the polish of 1,000 presentations, though, unlike many of his peers, the markings indicated actual battlefield experience from his younger days. The dean's mandibles clicked softly as he approached the human, towering over her by nearly 2 feet. "Commander Cruz," he said, his translator rendering his complex clicks and whistles into the human's language. "The War College is honored by your unusual presence." The pause was deliberate, establishing the hierarchy. "As I mentioned in our correspondence, we believe in exposing our elite cadets to diverse tactical philosophies, even those from species with more limited military histories." Behind the dean stood a row of holographic portraits, legendary Vexari commanders whose campaigns had shaped galactic maps for centuries. Their battle honors and kill counts scrolled beneath each image in a continuous feed of glory. "Your species' rapid advancement has been noted," the dean continued, mandibles now spread in what humans might interpret as a smile, but which signaled preparation to feed among Vexari. "We look forward to your perspective on primitive warfare techniques and how they might serve as historical footnotes to our comprehensive doctrine." The amphitheater had filled now. Nearly 800 cadets and 200 faculty members settled into their positions, many leaning forward with a mixture of curiosity and dismissive amusement. Humans were still novelties in this sector, diplomatic partners at best, curiosities at worst. "The floor is yours, Commander," Dean Vorun said, stepping back with a flourish of his upper limbs that indicated both permission and dismissal. "Please enlighten us on the human approach to conflict." Elena Cruz stepped forward, her movement efficient and direct. She carried no datapad, no holographic prompter. The silence that fell was not one of respect, but of curiosity. What could this bipedal creature possibly teach the architects of the obsidian shield formation, the tacticians who had never known true defeat? "Thank you, Dean Vorun," Cruz began, her voice unexpectedly carrying through the vast space without technological amplification. "Before I begin my prepared remarks, I'd like to ask a simple question of this esteemed assembly." She paused, eyes scanning the room with methodical precision. "How many of you have truly won a war?" The question hung in the air like a sudden vacuum. Faculty members shifted in their seats, mandibles clicking in confusion or irritation. Winning wars was what the Vexari did. It was their evolutionary purpose, their cultural identity. "I don't mean achieved victory in a battle simulation," Cruz continued into the uncomfortable silence. I don't mean executed a perfect obsidian shield formation during a controlled exercise. I mean fought against an enemy who refused to follow your predictions, who adapted faster than your models could calculate, and who ultimately forced you to reassess everything you thought you knew about warfare. From the front row, Professor Zelthak, the college's most decorated tactical theorist, rose on his 4 hind legs, his front appendages gesturing in sharp, agitated movements. Commander, he clicked, not bothering to hide his disdain. The Vexari Empire has not known defeat in 7 centuries. Our formations have proven mathematically superior in every major engagement since the dorsal conflict. Perhaps your species' limited understanding of multidimensional battle theory prevents you from... The Battle of Saren Ridge, Cruz interrupted, her tone unchanged. She made a small gesture, and the holographic archives at the edge of the room shimmered, then projected a massive tactical display above the central stage. Vexari Imperial Date 4726.3. The display showed a mountain range. Vexari forces arrayed in their perfect formation at the foot of a ridge. As the simulation played, however, the opposing forces, a coalition of 3 minor species, did not engage as expected. Instead, they triggered massive avalanches from hidden positions, burying nearly 40% of the Vexari forces before a shot was fired. The Kepler ambush, Cruz continued, and the display shifted again. Imperial Date 5042.8. Another battle materialized. This one showing a Vexari fleet in standard approach formation, suddenly caught between gravitational anomalies that hadn't appeared on their sensors. The fleet, unable to maintain formation, was picked apart by smaller, more maneuverable ships. The room had gone completely silent. These engagements weren't in the standard curriculum. They had been classified, some even expunged from official records. I could continue, Cruz said calmly. The Vexari military has experienced at least 27 major tactical failures in the past 3 centuries alone. Your educational archives have simply reclassified them as strategic adjustments or removed them entirely. Dean Vorin stepped forward, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. Commander Cruz, those records are classified at the highest level. Your access to was granted by your own admiralty, Cruz finished for him. They want this college to hear what I have to say. They're concerned that centuries of theoretical victory have left the Vexari military vulnerable to species who have learned to evolve their tactics, species like mine. She turned to face the cadets directly now, ignoring the increasingly agitated faculty. Your obsidian shield formation is considered the pinnacle of military deployment. It's been refined over centuries, accounting for every variable, creating an impenetrable offensive and defensive posture simultaneously. She paused. At least, that's the theory. With another gesture, she summoned a complex 3-dimensional model of the formation, hundreds of ships arrayed in a geometric pattern that shifted and adjusted based on enemy movements. It's beautiful, Cruz admitted. Mathematically elegant. The problem is that it relies entirely on enemy predictability. It assumes that any rational opponent will take the path of least resistance, will optimize their approach using the same tactical frameworks that you would use. She waved her hand, and the formation began to break apart as simulated enemy ships took completely irrational approaches, sacrificing key assets without apparent strategy, creating deliberate vulnerabilities that made no sense until they revealed themselves as traps. Humans don't fight wars like you do, Cruz said, her voice still calm, but taking on an edge that cut through the growing murmurs. We don't have the luxury of overwhelming technological superiority or millennia of uncontested dominance. We had to learn to win against enemies who should have destroyed us. We had to become unpredictable, irrational by your standards, adaptive beyond the capabilities of your most advanced models. Professor Talreth, a spindly Vexari specializing in species psychology, rose from his seat. With respect, Commander, what are your actual battlefield credentials? How many engagements have you personally commanded? Cruz turned to him, a small smile forming. 17 major engagements. Professor, 12 as tactical officer, 5 as primary commander. My most recent was the Proxima Centauri border skirmish with the Haldorian Expeditionary Force. The name dropped like a stone in the amphitheater. The Haldorians were among the most feared warriors in the known galaxy, not for their technology, but for their savagery and unpredictability. And they had withdrawn from Proxima Centauri under human pressure. Impossible, Talreth clicked. Our analysis indicated that the Haldorian withdrawal was due to internal political— Your analysis was wrong, Cruz interrupted again. Just as your analysis has been wrong about human military capability for the past 70 years. We've allowed it to be wrong because it served our purposes. The division in the audience was becoming visible now. Most of the senior faculty remained hostile, their postures rigid with affront. But many of the cadets, particularly the younger ones, were leaning forward with increasing interest. One female cadet in the third row, Mira Tell, according to the nameplate on her uniform, was actually taking notes, her eyes never leaving Cruz. There's a fundamental difference, Cruz continued, between how the Vexari plan war and how humans fight war. You believe that with enough processing power, enough variables accounted for, war becomes a solvable equation. We know better. We've learned through bitter experience that the moment actual lives are at stake, when resources are truly limited and extinction is a possibility, all models break down. She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show a simple graphic. A Vexari tactical manual on one side, a human military field guide on the other. Your manual has remained essentially unchanged for 2 centuries, she said. Refinements, additions. But the core doctrine is static. Our field manuals are updated every 6 months, with critical revisions distributed weekly during active conflicts. By the time you've analyzed one human approach, we've already developed 3 alternatives. Dean Voron's patience had clearly reached its limit. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation, as he stepped forward. Commander Cruz, he said, his translator barely keeping up with his rapid clicks. While this historical perspective is fascinating, perhaps a demonstration would better serve our cadets. Our tactical simulator is at your disposal. Would you care to demonstrate these adaptive approaches in a controlled environment? The challenge was clear. The simulator was programmed by Vexari engineers, based on Vexari assumptions. It was a trap designed to humiliate the human. Cruz's smile widened slightly. I'd be delighted. Dean, shall we use one of your standard training scenarios? The Dean's upper limbs flexed in satisfaction. The defense of Senrak would be appropriate. A straightforward planetary defense scenario that our 4th-year cadets have mastered. Perfect, Cruz replied. I assume I'll command the defending forces against your simulator's attack algorithms? Correct, the Dean said, gesturing toward a control podium that rose from the stage floor. The parameters are fixed. Standard Vexari defensive resources against a numerically superior aggressor. The simulator has never been defeated when attacking. Cruz approached the podium, studying its controls briefly before placing her hands on the interface. The holographic display expanded, showing a detailed planetary system, Senrak, a key Vexari colony world with valuable resources. The defensive forces appeared as blue indicators, a typical Vexari battle group arranged in the early stages of an obsidian shield formation. Beginning simulation, an automated voice announced. Aggressor forces deploying in 3, 2, 1. Red indicators appeared at the system's edge, a massive invasion fleet moving in perfect coordination, probing for weaknesses in the Vexari defenses. The faculty watched with barely concealed satisfaction. This scenario had been optimized over decades. No defensive strategy had ever repelled the simulated attack. It would be a humbling experience for the human. Cruz's fingers danced across the controls. Immediately, Her blue forces broke formation. "What is she doing?" whispered a cadet behind Miratel. Instead of reinforcing the obsidian shield, Cruz abandoned the formation entirely. She pulled her capital ships back, seemingly surrendering orbital superiority. Defensive platforms around the planet powered down. Supply depots were left virtually unguarded. The Red Forces, programmed to exploit weakness, surged forward toward the apparent vulnerabilities. Simulation time elapsed. 2 minutes. The automated voice announced. Aggressor forces advancing to secondary phase. Professor Zelthak's mandibles clicked in amusement. "A novel approach, Commander. But I'm afraid you've already lost orbital control. The scenario doesn't allow for—" He stopped mid-sentence as the simulation suddenly shifted. The supposedly abandoned supply depots exploded as the aggressors approached, taking out significant portions of the invasion force. What appeared to be defensive platforms suddenly accelerated. They weren't platforms at all, but disguised mines that attached themselves to the largest enemy ships. "What's happening?" Dean Voren demanded, his 6 eyes blinking rapidly in confusion. "I'm fighting like a human," Cruz replied calmly, her hands still moving across the controls. "Your simulation assumes I'll prioritize holding territory and protecting assets. I don't care about either. I only care about destroying your ability to make war." On the display, the blue forces that had retreated now emerged from hiding places throughout the system. Not in formation, but in seemingly random patterns that nonetheless caught the red forces in devastating crossfires. Smaller craft that had appeared to flee were actually deploying what looked like civilian vessels, which now revealed themselves as carriers for short-range fighters that swarmed the enemy support ships. Simulation time elapsed. 7 minutes, the automated voice announced, a new note of something like confusion in its synthetic tones. Aggressor forces at 60% capacity and declining. The audience watched in stunned silence. The Red Forces, the invincible simulation that had never lost, were being systematically dismantled by tactics that violated every principle taught at the War College. "You're not fighting according to established doctrine," Professor Talreth objected. "The simulation isn't designed to—" "Exactly," Cruz interrupted, never taking her eyes from the controls. "Your actual enemies won't fight according to your doctrines either. That's the point." On the display, the remaining Red Forces attempted to regroup, to form their own version of the Obsidian Shield. Cruz's blue forces immediately broke contact, scattering to the edges of the system. "Running away?" Dean Voren asked, a note of hope in his voice. "No," Cruz replied, changing the nature of the conflict. The display zoomed out to show the broader strategic situation. The blue forces were attacking something the red forces had ignored entirely. The supply chain, fuel depots, ammunition stores, repair facilities, all the supporting infrastructure that the simulation had assumed would be protected by the advancing fleet. Simulation time elapsed. 12 minutes, the automated voice announced. Aggressor forces at 30% capacity and unable to sustain operations. Defensive victory achieved. A stunned silence fell over the amphitheater. The scenario had never been defeated. Certainly not in 12 minutes, less than a quarter of the expected simulation time. "That was—" Dean Voren began, then seemed unable to find the words. "Unorthodox," Cruz supplied, "but effective, and more importantly, adaptable. If we ran this simulation again, I wouldn't use the same approach. The moment a tactic becomes predictable, it becomes vulnerable." She turned to the audience. "Would anyone like to see another scenario?" Cadet Miratel's hand shot up immediately, followed by dozens of others, mostly younger cadets, but even a few junior faculty members now. "The Siege of Volterra Prime," suggested Mira, her voice carrying clearly despite her junior status. "It's considered unwinnable from the defender's position." Cruz nodded. "Excellent choice. Dean Voren, may I proceed?" The dean, still visibly unsettled, nodded stiffly. The holographic display reset, showing a different system, Volterra Prime, a fortress world with massive defensive installations but limited mobile forces, surrounded by an overwhelming enemy armada. "Beginning simulation," the automated voice announced. "Aggressor forces deploying." This time, Cruz didn't wait for the red forces to appear. She immediately began reconfiguring the blue defenders in ways that made several faculty members click in protest. Defense installations were repurposed, planetary shields collapsed in specific sectors, and the limited fleet was broken into tiny squadrons that seemed too small to be effective. Simulation time elapsed. 3 minutes. Aggressor forces breaching outer defense perimeter. The Red invasion force pushed through the gaps Cruz had seemingly left open, only to encounter deadly crossfires from defense platforms that had appeared inactive. What looked like retreating civilian transports suddenly reversed course, revealing themselves as explosive drones that crashed into the largest enemy ships. "She's using the same tricks," Professor Zelthak objected. "The simulation isn't—" "No," Cruz corrected him. "I'm using entirely different tactics unified by the same principle: adaptability. Watch more carefully." On the display, the Red forces attempted to adjust to the ambushes and traps, only to find that the defensive strategy had already shifted again. Areas they avoided based on the previous pattern suddenly became killing grounds. Sectors they thought secure were compromised by defenders who prioritized inflicting damage over holding position. Simulation time elapsed. 9 minutes. Aggressor forces at 40% capacity and unable to achieve primary objectives. Defensive victory achieved. Another stunned silence fell over the amphitheater. 2 unwinnable scenarios, defeated in less than half the expected time. "One more," Cruz suggested. "Let's try something different. The quantum corridor blockade. I believe that's your most advanced scenario?" Dean Varun's mandibles clicked rapidly. The quantum corridor scenario was reserved for senior faculty wargames. It had never been solved, even by the program's architects. "That simulation requires extensive briefing and preparation," he objected. "It involves 11-dimensional space-time calculations and—" "Perfect," Cruz interrupted. "Let's see what happens when we stop calculating and start adapting." Before the dean could object further, Cruz initiated the scenario. The holographic display transformed into a bewildering representation of overlapping quantum corridors, the rare space-time phenomena that allowed faster-than-light travel between specific cosmic coordinates. The Blue Defenders were tasked with blockading a critical junction against a technologically superior enemy, with perfect intelligence about defensive positions. The faculty leaned forward. This was a scenario based on pure Vexari theoretical physics. No human could possibly understand the complexities involved, let alone. Cruz's hands moved across the controls with increasing speed. Instead of positioning her forces according to standard blockade doctrine, she began doing something that made several physics professors click in alarm. She was destabilizing the quantum corridors themselves. "That's not possible," objected Professor Zelthak. "The corridors are fixed phenomena. You can't alter their—" "According to your models, yes." Cruz agreed without looking up. "But 3 years ago, humans discovered that quantum corridors can be temporarily shifted by introducing specific resonance patterns at their entry points. Your scientists will discover the same in approximately 18 months. On the display, the blue forces were deploying what appeared to be simple energy buoys at specific coordinates. As the Red invasion force began to emerge from the corridors, the geometry of space itself seemed to twist, depositing enemy ships into unexpected coordinates, some directly in the firing range of waiting defenders, others into empty space light years from their intended destination. Simulation time elapsed, 6 minutes. Aggressor forces at 20% capacity and unable to maintain corridor integrity. Defensive victory achieved. The amphitheater erupted in a cacophony of clicking mandibles and agitated movement. What they had just witnessed wasn't just an unorthodox tactic. It was a fundamental challenge to Vexari physics. Dean Voren stepped forward, his posture rigid with what humans might recognize as shock. His 6 eyes fixed on Cruz with an intensity that would have intimidated most beings. "Commander," he said, his translator struggling to convey the complex emotions in his clicks. "What you've demonstrated is impossible. Our simulations are based on established physical laws and tactical doctrines refined over millennia." "No," Cruz replied, stepping away from the control podium. "What I've demonstrated is evolution, adaptation, the willingness to discard even your most fundamental assumptions when they no longer serve your survival." She turned to address the entire audience again. "The Vexari Empire has survived for millennia because, until recently, you've faced opponents who think like you do, who operate within the same tactical frameworks, who share your assumptions about how war should be conducted. But the galaxy is changing. New species are emerging who never received your tactical manuals, who developed in isolation with entirely different approaches to conflict." Cruz gestured toward the still active display showing the shattered remnants of the simulation's invasion force. "Humanity fought itself nearly to extinction before we reached the stars. We learned warfare through desperation, through the kind of existential terror that the Vexari haven't experienced in thousands of years. We don't fight to protect our doctrine or to prove our models correct. We fight to survive, adapting constantly, discarding what doesn't work without hesitation or sentimentality." She walked to the center of the stage, her posture relaxed despite the tension filling the room. "But here's what your historical records don't show, what your intelligence reports haven't emphasized. Once humans stopped fighting each other, we developed something even more powerful than adaptive tactics." With a gesture, she changed the holographic display one final time. It showed the emblem of the United Earth Fleet, but surrounded by dozens of other species insignias, many from worlds the Vexari considered primitive or strategically irrelevant. "We developed collaborative warfare. We share our doctrines, freely and openly. We absorb the tactical insights of every species willing to work with us. Our military manuals aren't just updated every 6 months. They're co-written by over 70 species, each contributing unique perspectives that no single evolutionary path could develop alone." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Several senior faculty members rose to their feet, mandibles clicking in what was clearly alarm. Dean Voren stepped forward, his voice now carrying a note of genuine concern rather than mere academic affront. "Are you claiming that humanity has been distributing military tactics to minor powers throughout the sector?" "For decades," Cruz confirmed. "Not to threaten you, to invite you. The greatest military minds in Vexari history are trapped in this college, refining theories in isolation while the rest of the galaxy evolves together." The Dean's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, processing the implications. "This is why the Admiralty sent you. They've discovered this network." "They've been invited to join it," Cruz corrected. "Multiple times. Your operational commanders, the ones actually fighting on your borders, have been quietly implementing our shared doctrines for years. It's only the theoretical branch, centered in institutions like this one, that has resisted." She looked directly at the Dean. "Your most promising graduates have been leaving the service within 5 years of completion. Did you never wonder why?" The question seemed to physically strike the Dean. He took a step back, mandibles now completely still, a sign of profound shock in Vexari body language. "They're being recruited," he said softly, "by this collaborative. They're choosing to evolve," Cruz replied, "rather than spend their careers refining theories that were outdated before they were born." The amphitheater had fallen completely silent. Even the most skeptical faculty members were now watching the exchange with their full attention, many clearly processing their own experiences with promising students who had inexplicably abandoned promising careers. Dean Voren's posture changed subtly. His upper limbs, which had been held rigidly in a position of academic authority, slowly lowered. His head tilted forward slightly, a gesture of deepest contemplation in Vexari body language. "The Admiralty," he said finally. "They want us to join this collaborative effort." "Yes," Cruz confirmed. "They've already committed in principle, but they needed the War College to understand why. Your institution trains the next generation of Vexari commanders. If you continue teaching obsolete doctrine while the operational branches evolve, the disconnect will eventually threaten your entire defense structure." The dean was silent for a long moment, his compound eyes, fixed on the holographic display, still showing the coalition of species emblems surrounding the human insignia. "Everything I have taught," he said finally. His voice so low, the translator barely caught it. "Everything this institution has stood for. You're saying it's not merely incomplete, but fundamentally flawed." "I'm saying it's static," Cruz replied gently. "And in warfare, static means vulnerable. The Vexari achieved dominance because you were once the most adaptive species in this sector. Your current doctrine is a fossil of that achievement, preserved but no longer alive." In a move that sent a shockwave through the audience, Dean Varun reached up and removed his ceremonial collar, the symbol of his academic authority that no Vexari would relinquish willingly. "I have served as Dean of Tactical Doctrine for 73 cycles," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent amphitheater. "In that time, I have authorized the expulsion of 42 students and 17 faculty members for proposing revisions that contradicted our established frameworks." He placed the collar carefully on the control podium. "Commander Cruz has demonstrated, beyond any rational dispute, that our foundational approach is vulnerable to adaptive adversaries. More importantly, she has revealed that the operational branches of our military have already begun evolving beyond our teachings." His 6 eyes swept the room, taking in the hundreds of stunned faces. "A teaching institution that can no longer teach relevant doctrine has failed in its primary purpose. I therefore tender my immediate resignation as dean, effective at the conclusion of this assembly." The announcement sent a visible shock through the room. Vexari officials almost never resigned, certainly not in such a public manner. The dean's action was itself a radical departure from tradition that emphasized his conviction. "I further recommend," he continued, "that the Admiralty appoint an interim leadership council, comprised of our most junior faculty and senior cadets, those least entrenched in our traditional frameworks, to oversee the complete revision of our curriculum in accordance with the collaborative doctrine Commander Cruz has described." From the third row, Cadet Miratel rose to her feet, her posture conveying both respect and resolution. "Dean Vorun," she said, her voice clear, despite the extraordinary breach of protocol in addressing the dean directly. "Many of us have questioned aspects of the traditional doctrine. We've studied historical engagements that seem to contradict our teachings. Your willingness to acknowledge these contradictions, it honors the true spirit of the War College, even as it challenges its letter." Around her, dozens of other cadets rose to their feet, a show of support that clearly surprised many of the senior faculty. The dean's mandibles clicked softly, a sound that the translator didn't convert, but which those familiar with Vexari expressions would recognize as something akin to a sad chuckle. "It seems," he said, "that the seeds of evolution were already present within our ranks. I simply lacked the vision to nurture them." He turned to Cruz. "Commander, I believe your demonstration has achieved its purpose more thoroughly than either your Admiralty or mine could have anticipated." Cruz nodded, her expression showing genuine respect. "Adaptation isn't just about tactics, Dean Voren. It's about institutional courage, the willingness to change course when evidence demands it. What you've done today demonstrates why the Vexari were once the most formidable military power in this sector, and why you may be so again as part of a collaborative effort rather than in isolation." The dean straightened, his posture regaining some of its former dignity despite the absence of his collar. The assembly is concluded. I ask that all faculty remain for an emergency transition meeting. Cadets are dismissed to quarters, with the exception of the senior class representatives, who will join the faculty discussion. As the amphitheater began to empty, with animated discussions breaking out among both cadets and faculty, Cruz gathered her few materials. She had accomplished more than her mission parameters required, not just demonstrating human tactical adaptability, but catalyzing an institutional transformation that might have taken years through conventional diplomatic channels. Dean Voren, now simply Professor Voren, approached her as she prepared to leave. "Commander," he said, his voice pitched for her alone, "you did not come merely to demonstrate tactical alternatives. You came to force a crisis." Cruz met his compound eyes directly. "Sometimes, evolution requires a catalyst. Your military leadership recognized that the War College had become too entrenched for gradual reform. And they chose you specifically," Voren observed. "A human woman, physically smaller than any Vexari officer, with no visible augmentations or weapons. The perfect psychological lever to dismantle our certainty." A small smile touched Cruz's lips. "The choice of envoy was as much a part of the tactic as the content of my presentation. If you'd known that in advance, you might have been prepared. That's the point. True adaptation means never knowing what form the next challenge will take." Vorun's mandibles clicked softly. "A final lesson well delivered. I find myself looking forward to learning from your collaborative, as a student, rather than an administrator." "The best commanders always remain students," Cruz replied. "That's something our species have in common, whatever our differences in approach." She extended her hand in the human gesture of respect. After a moment's hesitation, Voren extended one of his upper limbs, carefully mimicking the handshake. "Until our next engagement, Commander Cruz." "Until then, Professor Voren." As Cruz made her way out of the amphitheater, she passed Cadet Miratel, who was deep in conversation with a group of junior faculty members. They were already pulling up alternative tactical models on portable displays, arguing energetically about applications and modifications. Tell looked up as Cruz passed, offering the formal Vexari salute, but with a subtle variation that incorporated a human hand gesture Cruz had used during her presentation. A small adaptation, but symbolically significant. Cruz returned the hybrid salute with a nod of acknowledgement. The real work would begin now, integrating centuries of Vexari tactical knowledge into the collaborative framework, teaching them to value adaptation over tradition, without discarding the genuine insights their long military history had generated. As the massive gates of the War College closed behind her, Cruz heard the continuing debates echoing from inside, voices raised not in defensive rejection, but in engaged reassessment. The distinctive clicking of Vexari speech patterns had taken on a different rhythm, faster and less formal. Her mission report would be concise: objective achieved, institutional transformation initiated, collaborative integration proceeding ahead of schedule. But the true measure of success would come in the next generation of Vexari commanders, those who understood that the greatest military strength lay not in perfect doctrine, but in perfect adaptability. In her earpiece, her ship's AI noted that the Admiralty was already requesting a preliminary briefing. Cruz permitted herself a satisfied smile as she headed toward the landing pad, where her shuttle waited. Behind her, a new chapter in Vexari military education was already being written, not by conquest, but by the most powerful weapon humanity had developed in its bloody history: the willingness to share rather than dominate, to evolve together rather than compete alone. The old Vexari would have considered it the ultimate defeat. The new Vexari, if Cruz's assessment was correct, would recognize it as the ultimate victory, not of one species over another, but of adaptation over stagnation. And in war, as in evolution, adaptation was the only true path to survival.